Hello, ladies and gentlemen, it's me again, and in this episode of Breath vs. Tears, we're looking at dungeons. And by dungeons, I primarily mean the divine beasts from Breath of the Wild and the temples from Tears of the Kingdom, alongside both games' versions of Hyrule Castle and Gloom's Approach in Tears. Now I have to say, straight up before we get into this, I am a Breath of the Wild fan first and a Legend of Zelda fan second. I don't have any attachment to traditional dungeon design, so that's not part of my bias in these videos. If you're a longtime Zelda fan looking for someone who'll consider these games' departure from convention in their analysis, then this video probably isn't for you. But feel free to stick around anyway, I could always use the views. Either way, even if Tears of the Kingdom was marketed as a return to form, the temples are a lot more like Breath of the Wild's divine beasts than they are like traditional dungeons. So when comparing the two, that aspect doesn't make a big difference anyway. Also, I'm not covering the boss battles at the end of these areas because I've already got another video comparing these games' boss battles if you want to check that out. Alright, so before we can really compare the dungeons in these two games, we need to establish their similarities. The divine beasts and the temples have a fair amount of common ground. Both require you to activate 4 or 5 switches in whatever order you like. After that, a final switch needs to be reached before proceeding to the boss fight. Most switches are activated by completing some kind of puzzle or reaching a hard-to-get-to spot, but there are some enemies trying to bar your way in these dungeons as well. Loot throughout the dungeons is minimal, mostly regulated to mid-quality weapons. So, just looking at Divine Beasts and Temples, we have 9 non-linear, puzzle-solving dungeons with some light combat and minimal rewards until after defeating the dungeon boss. This formula is pretty simple, but let's get into the differences. These differences are the lead-ups, the different dungeons' aesthetics, and the puzzles. First is the lead-ups. We couldn't really talk about these dungeons without at least briefly covering the quests that you're required to complete before tackling these dungeons. But we all also want to get to the dungeon analysis itself, so I'll try to keep this bit concise. Breath of the Wild's quests leading up to the Divine Beasts have 2 stages. The first is a short mainline quest, and it's nice that these are short because it means that you don't have to toil away for an hour or more to get to whichever dungeon. I think the longest one of these is the Yiga stealth quest, and then these quests are followed by boarding missions to get onto the beasts themselves. I think these boarding missions are really cool, although I think that some people find them gimmicky and overly easy. Tears of the Kingdom's lead-ups are longer, and some of these lead-ups are really fun quest lines, but you do have to take more time doing other stuff before you actually get to do the dungeon. For instance, to enter the Lightning Temple, you need to find Riju, defend the Oasis from Gibdos, defend Gerudo Town from Gibdos, activate 3 pillars in the desert, and get in a brief fight with the Queen Gibdo before you can enter. Now, some of these questlines, like this Gerudo questline and the Wind Temple lead-up, are great, but if you just want to get to the dungeon already, they can be a bit annoying. I've been replaying both of these games while doing this series just to have the experiences fresh in my mind, and also because both of these games absolutely slap, and these questlines do feel particularly tedious on a second playthrough, although you can get through them a lot faster because you already know roughly how they go. The other thing I take issue with in Tears of the Kingdom lead-ups is that, while some of these questlines are fun, some of these questlines suck. In Breath of the Wild, it didn't matter if you had a dud lead-up quest because it probably only took you 20 minutes or so. But take the Zora questline for example. In Tears of the Kingdom, it's literally nothing but fetch quests. You talk to one fish, then you talk to another fish, then you go back to talk to the first fish, then talk to another fish and give him something that the previous fish gave you, then go find another fish. You get the point. That questline in particular is also really cryptic. Like, seriously, Sidon, what exactly do you want me to do to prove the existence of a fish island? I took a picture of it on my Puripad, it's right here, it looks like a fish, what more do you want? I did as much as I could to avoid using guides while playing Tears of the Kingdom the first time, so I legitimately got stuck trying to figure out which fish wanted what, and after 2 hours of wandering between the various fish, I just left, and I didn't come back until after doing another one of the main temple quests. The good thing is that this is the worst case of a bad lead-up questline, and the others vary from tolerable to enjoyable, but it is still really annoying. Next up, we gotta talk about the aesthetics. I just criticized Tears of the Kingdom a good bit, but when it comes to aesthetics, we're swapping around. Breath of the Wild was definitely lacking in this department. I know some people think that the Divine Beasts make for really ugly dungeons, and I don't find them ugly per se, but I am definitely bothered by the fact that they all look the same. On the outside, there's some environmental differences, like one's in the sky, one's in a lake, one's in a volcano, and one's in a desert, but insofar as the actual dungeon dressing, they all look the same. Tears of the Kingdom, on the other hand, has 5 very aesthetically independent dungeons, and 3 of them are really good. The Water and Spirit Temple are pretty bland, but at least they don't look the same as each other, so you could make an argument that they're still aesthetically better than the Divine Beasts. I'd say they're about on par. The Fire, Lightning, and Wind Temples, on the other hand, make some very strong aesthetic choices. The Wind Temple is an airship inside of a giant cyclone. The Fire Temple is an ancient mining city with rail cars inside a volcano, and the Lightning Temple is a straight-up pyramid complete with believable traps that somewhat resemble real-world Egyptian tomb traps. The aesthetic in these 3 dungeons is top tier. Overall, thus far, at least to my mind, these dungeons have pretty much been tied up. Breath of the Wild has better lead-ups, Tears of the Kingdom has better aesthetics. So let's move on to puzzles. A lot of the puzzles in these games involve using the game's runes, and while I still want to save most of my thoughts on runes for a runes video, we do definitely need to talk about them here too. Breath of the Wild's runes are very simple and somewhat limited. Limitations can be good for puzzle solving. What it means in this context is that puzzles generally have one solution. That's not necessarily a bad thing for puzzles, but a lot of people feel that this design choice to make Breath's runes so static is out of place in an open world game. Tears of the Kingdom's runes, on the other hand, are a double-edged sword. On the positive side, they are incredibly powerful and flexible and can be used in many different ways, often in combination with each other. This means that puzzles can have multiple solutions, which is pretty cool. It also means, however, that puzzles are relatively easy to cheese or to skip entirely. And this is completely my own personal opinion, but I think that Tears of the Kingdom's runes are just a little bit too strong. Okay, that's enough about the runes though. Let's look at some of the unique puzzle-solving aspects of each of these games. Obviously, with 9 dungeons to go through, I can't analyze all these puzzles, so I'm going to be painting with fairly broad strokes. Breath of the Wild's dungeons all had some manipulable aspect of the dungeon's layout. For the bird one, you could tilt the entire dungeon to one side or the other, causing items to slide and allowing you to paraglide to otherwise unreachable locations. For the salamander, you could tilt the whole thing a full 90 degrees, fundamentally changing your navigation of each room. In the camel one, you could spin the interior sections to align different platforms together or to channel electric currents. And in the elephant, you could manipulate the trunk, allowing you to shower different elements of the dungeon with water. These fancy aspects of each dungeon didn't play into the solution for every puzzle, but they were a really cool way of making you think about each dungeon and each puzzle differently. The active terrain element is one thing that Tears of the Kingdom dungeons don't have. Next comes the theming of these puzzles. Most of the dungeons in both games have one theme that is used to solve at least a couple of the puzzles. Breath of the Wild's elephant had a lot of water-based puzzles. The camel centers around electrical current puzzles. The bird one has some wind-based puzzles, and the salamander has a couple of puzzles involving moving flames around. Similarly, Tears of the Kingdom's water temple utilizes these water bubbles and draining some pools. The lightning temple has a lot of mirror puzzles, which really makes it more of a light temple than a lightning temple. The lightning is only used to activate the switches and has very little to do with the puzzles themselves. I've accidentally called this the light temple a few times just because it makes more sense. The fire temple has all these minecarts and revolves around getting to the right location, and the wind temple has a couple of puzzles that have to do with ice, which once again means that they gave a temple the wrong name. And the spirit temple makes the use of a lot of zonai construction. I think that all of these themes for each game are good ideas, and a lot of them worked. A lot of them worked really well, but there are others that didn't. And much like what I've said in other videos, I think that Tears of the Kingdom simultaneously reaches higher highs and lower lows. My absolute favorite dungeon from either of these games is definitely the Light Temple. The Lightning Temple. And I don't think that's a controversial pick. The puzzles have an awesome central theme, with how you need to find ways to bounce light around to many different locations. Light even plays a role in the dungeon's boss fight, which is a really cool touch, even if I don't like that boss purely because of the way light is incorporated into that fight. Overall, there's very little to dislike in the Lightning Temple. It'll probably get its own video on this channel at some point, because it does almost everything right. However, if I had to pick the two worst dungeons out of these two games, they'd both be Tears of the Kingdom dungeons as well. And you probably already know which two they are because they're pretty universally disliked, which really surprises me. I don't see many people defending these two dungeons, and that catches me off guard because they're not objectively awful, it's that there's a lot of things about them that are just kind of middling, and so a lot of people don't like them. I'm, of course, in case you haven't already figured it out, talking about the Water Temple and the Spirit Temple. In both of these cases, the lead-up is actually better than the dungeon itself. The Zora Waterworks, which wasn't a dungeon, might have been a better dungeon than either of these two dungeons. But why do these dungeons get so much hate? Well, on top of being aesthetically dull, the puzzles are uninteresting. The Water Temple is trivially easy, none of these puzzles even begin to scratch the surface of what you may call difficult. The anti-gravity mechanic is an interesting gimmick, but it loses its novelty by the time you actually get to the dungeon, so there's not much in the way of interesting content there either. This dungeon maybe takes 25 minutes and just isn't intriguing. Also, why isn't this temple in the water? There are various lakes in the same area, and the ocean is in sight if you just peek over the top of the hill. The Spirit Temple only really even counts as a dungeon if you include the process you have to go through to assemble this construct that is harder to fight with than your own bare hands. This temple is already disliked enough that some ranking videos out there just ignore it on their lists completely, and as someone who never really enjoyed Ultra Hand builds that much, I was particularly frustrated with it. The puzzles aren't challenging, they're just tedious. Then you have to escort, or if you're crazy, pilot, this half-drunk mech across 5 kilometers of open depths to get to the worst boss fight in the game. Oh, right, this isn't a boss fight video anymore. Just ignore that I said that. Now, there's one more comparison between Breath and Tears I want to make here, and I didn't list this at first because it's more of a storytelling thing than a dungeon thing, so it's already been covered in this series. But it is something that happens in the dungeons, so we do have to at least briefly mention it. And this part I really will make short. Tears of the Kingdoms all have basically the same series of cutscenes as you progress towards the end of the dungeon. First you hear the sage off in the distance, and then you hear it again once you actually get to the dungeon. And the last cutscene, which I think is over 7 minutes, is almost an exact copy between all the dungeons. I'm all for game story and lore, but after the second cutscene like that, I really wanted to just start skipping them. I wish that these cutscenes evolved as you went. We got the basic story after number 1. What if later cutscenes progressed the story or filled in details? But they don't. It's just the same thing over and over. Breath of the Wild had different cutscenes incorporated into each dungeon questline, expanding the story in different ways each time. These cutscenes are still one of the weakest links in that game's storytelling, but at least each one is unique, and each one also hints at what the reward for beating each dungeon is, which is kind of clever. Alright, we're that many minutes into this video, and I think it's about time to talk about the other dungeons in these games. That means both versions of Hyrule Castle and Gloom's Approach. Breath of the Wild's castle has very little in ways of puzzles, instead focusing on combat and some truly sick atmosphere. Making your way through Hyrule Castle is more like a set piece for a one-man siege than it is anything else, and it's really epic. Fighting through guardians, navigating the castle interior, and scaling the towers for probably the most grand lead-up to a final boss I have ever seen. Some people would argue that this doesn't even count as a dungeon, but other people would, so I threw it in here, and it's just so good. Tears of the Kingdom's Hyrule Castle has hard competition to live up to, and it doesn't quite get there, but it still is pretty good. You have to chase Zelda around and do all these fights, so it is similarly based around combat instead of puzzles, and I do like that it is also high enough up in the air that you have to construct a way to get there. This was particularly challenging for me because I didn't realize I could upgrade my battery until after the Spirit Temple. Overall, pretty good. The Puppet Zelda reveal is obvious even to non-Zelda players, but that's, once again, more of a story structure weakness than anything else at this point. Gloom's Approach is Tears of the Kingdom's 7th and final dungeon, and takes the same role in the story as Breath of the Wild's Hyrule Castle, albeit in a linear form rather than a sandbox form. These fights are pretty hard down here, which is nice, because it gives the enemies a chance to wear your supplies down a little bit before you get to Ganondorf. And anyone who had to fight Ganondorf without Gloom Food the first time around knows that that's the way to do it. It adds so much tension and satisfaction to the fight. It's just so good. It's just a better way to do the fight. The battle against Ganondorf's army at the end of this is pretty large and pretty epic as well, and it's respectably challenging. But I think the best part of Gloom's Approach is the slow build-up. the eerie music that quietly gets louder and more harrowing that makes it almost as good of a build-up as Breath of the Wild's Hyrule Castle. So now, coming to the conclusion. Saying which game did better here is really hard. On one hand, I think that Tears of the Kingdom has the best dungeon, but it also has the two worst dungeons. And while I don't think that Breath of the Wild has any particularly weak dungeons, they all have this common aesthetic issue that drags them all down. And I know the common wisdom would be to put Tears of the Kingdom on the pedestal, but I'm pretty suspicious of common wisdom. For the first time in this series, I think I have to give these two games a tie. Now obviously this is subjective, both these games have some strong points and some weak points, and depending on what's important to you, you may think differently. I think that most old Zelda fans will prefer Tears of the Kingdom's dungeons, but I think that's almost entirely because of their aesthetic independence and the boss fights that follow them. On the other hand, someone who wants consistency in the quality of their dungeons may favor Breath of the Wild. Since there aren't really any duds in that game, it's not like you're going to be disappointed when you get to the third or fourth dungeon, because the quality is consistent. Excluding the aesthetic problems, the Divine Beasts are all in the medium to good range of quality. So, yeah, I'm marking the debate on dungeons here down as a tie, at least for now. That's all for the day, though. I'll see you all again soon. Well, not really. I can't actually see any of you, but you know what I mean.